Make this webinar a reality. We're very grateful for the good work of New Matrix, the Presbyterian Foundation, for Baptist News Global, for Truett Seminary and the Truett Church Network, for the Gardner Webb Divinity School, for the Lake Institute for Faith in Giving, and for the good work of the Minch Center at Belmont University. The Church Network also is a partner that helps us take all of the videos of this and post them and share them with people that want to watch them after the fact. So I'm going to turn over the hosting responsibilities to my good friend Jim Kitchens, who's going to take us through and introduce our very, very special guest this morning. So
thank you, Matt. Appreciate that. These 3 weeks, we're going to be talking to people who are doing significant ministries in the church that are opportunities for all of us to think about making a part of the ministry that we do together. Some of you may have read Susan Beaumont's latest blog, in which she reminds us we are not at the new normal yet. We may not be at the new normal, whatever that means, for another couple of years, and yet we can't just sit back and wait for that new normal to emerge. We have to take this opportunity to think about ways we can serve our communities and ways we can strengthen our churches by adding pieces maybe we've never thought about having as a part of our ministry before. So over these next 3 weeks, we're going to be listening to some folks who are actually doing some things that we might want to share in or to learn more about. This week, Michelle Snyder is our presenter, and it's a real pleasure for me to get to introduce her. She's been a member of the Soul Shop team. You'll be hearing a lot more about Soul Shop today, since its beginning in 2014, and is now the movement's executive director. Michelle holds an MDiv from Pittsburgh Seminary and a Master of Social Work from the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work. She's Soul Shop's primary presenter and its faith community specialist. Soul Shop has really had quite a reach around the country. She's presented her Soul Shop workshops in 37 states, 4 countries, and has been a speaker at a number of national and regional conferences. I love the name of her published book, in which she is the co-author, Life, Death, and Reinvention, The Gift of the Impossibly Messed Up Life. Sounds like a life many of us are leading these days. Now, in addition to her suicide prevention work, Michelle's a mental health therapist, an executive leadership coach, a church consultant, mother of 2 teenage daughters, a pastor's spouse. She was never ordained herself, so she's a ruling. Are you a ruling elder, Michelle? She is a ruling elder for all you Presbyterians for whom that distinction is important. And she loves deep fried pickles, and who doesn't? Michelle's a senior associate with New Matrix and a consultant and coach with the Center for Healthy Churches. So Michelle, we're really glad to welcome you to the webinar this morning.
Thank you.
Let me just say to folks, if you have questions as we go along, as Michelle is speaking and I'm talking with her, please put those up in the chat and we'll try to get to them before we end our session today. So Michelle, let's get started. Welcome.
Thank you.
I know you've been concerned about mental health issues for a long, long time. And sort of what were some of those mental health issues that led to the development of Soul Shop? And why have you been particularly interested in working with church leaders?
Yeah, I don't know that mental health issues is the place that I would start, actually.
Okay, you start where you would.
Yeah. So Soul Shop was started by a pastor who was working in a small town in Southern Ohio back in the 90s. So in the 90s, we were doing a much worse job at dealing with and talking about suicide and all kinds of mental health issues. Back in the 90s, we weren't doing much at all with it. And he was in a small church. It was a large church in a small town in Southern Ohio when 3 students died by suicide in one academic year. And so he got trained in suicide prevention and just started doing trainings as an extension of his ministry, as a, kind of a way of saying, we got to do something about this. And so I'll be that. I'll start. And he said repeatedly, I would go into fire halls or community centers all over Southern Ohio, and to talk about suicide, and I'd get 100 people that would come out. That was when contagion was on the rise, and people they were so scared of this thing. And he said there would be first responders and teachers and people people in healthcare and parents and grandparents and kind of all manner of people, and not a single person would be a pastor. In a room of 100 people, there wouldn't be a single pastor there. And so he asked the question, what is it about the ways we're having this conversation that isn't capturing the theological imagination of the church? And how do we do better? One statistic that I like, that I think is very helpful. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention reports on the percentage of communities in a state that lack sufficient access to mental health treatment. And I have never seen a number lower than 58%. Jim, do you remember the number in California? Is it 77.8% or 78% of communities in California that lack sufficient access to mental health treatment?
It's around that figure.
Yeah, it's 70 something. In Pennsylvania, it's 58, and that's the lowest I've seen. In Arkansas, it's 66%. So what we're saying is that no matter where you are, the majority of communities where we find ourselves lack sufficient access to mental health treatment to meet the needs of the people who are in them. And there's a story that I have come to really love. It's a true story, about a psychiatrist in Zimbabwe, who's one psychiatrist out of 12 in a country of 14 million people. And he lost a youth to suicide because the girl was from the village and couldn't get into the city. Obviously, that was happening all the time. And he said, I just realized what we're doing is not working. It's not working at all. And I asked myself the question, I did some soul searching and said, what does every village in Zimbabwe have in abundance? And I came to the conclusion that what they have is grandmothers. And so he started training grandmothers in basic listening skills. And they built a bench in villages in Zimbabwe, and grandma would go sit on the bench, and then people would come talk to grandma. And they did clinical trials or clinical research on this, and they found that people had better outcomes who talked to grandma than who went to any of the other medical providers. And talk about capturing theological imagination, because I ask myself then the question, if our systems are failing too, what is one thing that every small town in America has in abundance? And I would say the answer is churches. There's a church on every corner, and sometimes they're across the street from each other. And those churches are filled with grandmothers. And so when we talk about why this and why now, there's this need. The need is a mental health need, but I think mental health is so broad. I think people are dealing with isolation and despair and relational disconnection and substance abuse and domestic violence and all these things that get clustered under mental health, but are really the things that cause desperation in our lives, with a system that is absolutely insufficient to meet those needs. And we also have churches. I saw a statistic once that said 87% of churches are stuck, struggling, or in decline, many of whom are asking, what is the new normal and what does it mean to be the church, and how do we give skin to these bones? And I feel like when we put those two things together, it creates some extraordinary possibility. So that's the way that I would answer your question, Jim. I think that it has been, yes, an interest in mental health, an interest in the social ills, an interest in the things that cause us desperation, but also a passion for the church to see it become its best self. And when I think about laying those two things on top of each other, I think that's very exciting work. What we do in Soul Shop is talk about how you minister to those who are impacted by suicide. And that we mean 4 different groups of people. So those who are thinking about suicide, the statistics are that 6% of adults and 17% of adolescents are thinking about suicide at any given time. So in any gathering of 100 people, statistically, reliably, on average, 6 of them are thinking about suicide. And in a youth group of 20 kids, statistically, reliably, on average, 3 or 4 of them are thinking about suicide. And so we've got a bunch of people among us who are thinking about suicide. We also have people who are worried about someone who is thinking about suicide that they don't know how to help. We have people who have lost someone to suicide who live with the pain of that forever. And we have people who have lived experience of suicidal thinking, who don't know how to tell their stories. And I start a Soul Shop training saying, you put those 4 groups of people together, we're probably talking about more than 50% of a congregation. And what it means is that on any average Sunday in America, it's very likely that most of our churches have people who are thinking about suicide sitting right beside people who have been suicidal in the past and have found ways to live. And I think if we could get those 2 groups of people talking to each other, we could completely change this conversation. So that's the passion point for Soul Shop. Did you mean to ask me questions, Jim? So I don't, yeah. You're muted.
You can just keep going. If I have a question I want to throw in there, I will, but I figure you're good.
Okay. Well, then I've got some slides just to sort of give you something to look at besides me. Matt, can I have the screen? Okay. Did you give it to me? Okay.
And while he's doing that,
Yep.
I'm going to put up the a couple of contact points for Soul Shop in the chat for people
Okay.
to write down if they want them.
Yeah. So one of the challenges when we do this work is that we don't always know how to identify the people who are at risk among us. And so we use this straw man of Jimmy Stewart to say, sometimes this is what desperate people look like. But we've also got so many people in our lives that don't look like that. Like we've got Robin Williams, and we've got Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade. Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, I like to point them out because they were at the top of their game. They were living the dream. And it is the case that some of the highest suicide risk in our communities, or by vocation anyway, are the people who have made it to the top. It's the psychiatrists and the veterinarians. Dentists have very high suicide rates. Orthodontists, people who have access to lethal means, and they get to the top and find it to be a pretty hopeless place. We've got Junior Seau and Marilyn Monroe, who, the kind of cool kids, cheerleader, popular, beautiful, hanging out with presidents. Suicide rates among Black men peak around age 25. So we've got this kind of societal despair that they live with around unemployment, mass incarceration, discrimination, that's driving high suicide rates among that demographic. We've got, and I like to show Walt Disney. He had lived experience of suicidal thinking, and he created the happiest place on earth. So we've got lots of different faces of suicide, and that, and when I say that our congregations are filled with people, this is really what suicide often looks like. It's people you wouldn't you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't know to ask about it. You wouldn't think about it. But when we look at the statistics, these numbers are loose. I say here almost 46,000 people die by suicide every year. That number has gone, they've reported twice since I put this number in this slide, and it's changed both times, but it's always right around 46 or 47%, or I'm sorry, 46 or 47,000 people, making it the 12th leading cause of death. But it's the second leading cause of death for people between the ages of 10 and 34. The belief is that suicide rates went up during COVID. It's kind of a thing you hear floated around. It's not true. They didn't. They went down. They went down 2 years running. I think they went down over 2 years, 6%. And it is true that during pandemics, you can track it historically, during pandemics, suicide rates actually generally decline. It's later here in the presentation, but one of my favorite quotes about suicide, and I think it's absolutely right, is that people die by suicide for all kinds of reasons, but it basically comes down to a loss of hope and a loss of social connection. Sometimes that loss of hope is a loss of hope around mental illness, but it's not the mental illness that's driving the suicide, it's the despair. And so during COVID, it was interesting because we were all pretty isolated, but we were isolated in solidarity. So there was a sense of usness and togetherness and rallying around a common cause that tends to reduce suicide rates. 2 weeks ago, the CDC put out data that they've gone back up 4%, which was what we predicted. We predicted that once life goes back to normal and people go back to feeling alone and despairing, that we were going to see them go up, and we have. Highest suicide rates for women are around age 50, where women are dealing with empty nest and menopause. Highest suicide rates for white men are between the ages of 45 and 65. And in fact, 70% of suicides in America are middle-aged white men between the ages of 45 and 65. So I always say to groups, you hear a lot about adolescent suicides. Communities are completely moved to action by youth suicides, but the people in those communities who have the highest risk are those kids' dads, at a rate of 70%. So yeah, there's probably all kinds of reasons that we could talk about that, but those are some of the highest suicide rates in America. In terms of number of suicides, we have about as many deaths to suicide as there are car accidents in the United States, twice as many suicides as homicides. More people die by suicide globally than all other armed conflict combined around the globe. So major public health crisis. And I've already said this, that more than half of a faith community is impacted by suicide. And so what we talk about is how do we create soul safe communities in the church? That's really the crux of Soul Shop. Is not about the numbers. It's not about the incidents. It's not about the kind of what's wrong. It's about how can we get this right? And we talk about the creation of a soul safe community, which is one that knows how to minister to suicidal desperation as a regular aspect of its life and work. And the thing about suicide, suicide can seem like kind of an esoteric conversation. It can seem a little specific. And in certain communities, like, it's what people want to talk about because they've had a slate of suicides or they've experienced suicide loss in the recent past, or that there's all kinds of things that will, a pastor had a sibling that died by suicide. So suicide gets certain people's attention, but there are a lot of folks that would say, like, this isn't really a conversation that is about me. They don't know that 6% of the adults and 17% of the kids they minister to are thinking about it, but it's not one of their pressing concerns. But what I like about suicide as an entry point is that it's a gateway conversation. People who are thinking about suicide is rarely about suicide. Suicide isn't like a thing that a person becomes obsessed with in isolation. Suicide is the only way that they can see to get out of the pain that they're in. And the pain that they're in is caused by all kinds of things. So I say that if a church can talk about suicide, in order for a church to be ready to talk about suicide, it needs to be ready to talk about everything, because all the stuff that plague us are the things we're going to end up talking about. We're going to talk about domestic violence. We're going to talk about issues of gender and sexuality. We're going to talk about divorce and substance use and abuse. We're going to talk about all the things that create desperation in our lives. And so no matter kind of what your front issue is, for some people, we've had a bunch of suicides in the community and we don't know what to do. But I would say if your issue is we have a lot of opioid addiction in our community and we don't know what to do, or we have a lot of domestic violence in our communities and we don't know what to do, or we have a lot of youth who don't see a future and are feeling depression, sadness, because they're comparing themselves to the people around them. 10 to 14-year-old girls have some of the fastest growing suicide rates in America. And it's this kind of crisis of the virtual space and how it's become distorted in the minds of our young people and in the lives of our young people. So those are all the things that we talk about at Soul Shop. Suicide is just the worst possible outcome of a community. Sometimes suicide can be the worst possible outcome for a person who is dealing with all of those other things. And so I think this ministry gives us a chance to ask, how do we minister to all those kinds of things to create worlds where people who live there would rather not be dead? And that's the work we do, the question that we ask. Let's see if I get this back. Here, this is the quote that we've kind of built the work around. People think about suicide for all kinds of reasons, but it basically comes down to two: a loss of hope and a loss of social connection. And David Litz, who this quote comes from, said, "And if the Church of Jesus Christ can't do something about those two things, then it might as well just close its doors." And so that's our question. Can the Church of Jesus Christ do something about those two things, hopelessness and disconnection? And we would suggest that it can. So one of the things we do in a training that I'm not going to talk about now is ask, what would it look like to preach about suicide as a regular aspect of our life and work, to normalize this issue and to create opportunities for people to talk about the stuff that really plagues them. And we've got lots of examples of suicide in the Bible. We go through a biblical we take a little biblical journey through all the places that suicide shows up. And there are lots of examples of them. We've got a suicide to save face in the Old Testament, suicide for control. We talk about the despair that Saul felt that caused him to end his life by suicide. We talk about Samson as an example of suicide for revenge. We talk about Jonah, who made stupid decisions that negatively affected everyone in his life to the point where he said, "You'd all be better off without me." We talk about how Judas's primary driver was probably guilt that caused him to end his life. We talk about places where bullying shows up, like in Elijah and Hagar. We talk about some of the places in the New Testament, like the Gerasene demoniac, or the son who was throwing himself in the fire and the water, and Jesus took care of him. We talk about Job and the desperation Job felt around his loss. The Philippian jailer was saved from suicide when Paul and Silas stuck around. So we use all of these images to say, what would it look like if we started teaching about this and preaching about it and praying about it in our corporate spaces? And then this is the last thing I'll say, and then we can chat. But one of the things we really believe is that suicide is never actually just about one thing. Living Works Education says that suicide is about multiple contributaries, even if you have mental illness, which new CDC data suggests that 54% of people who die by suicide did not have major depression at the time of their death. even if you have major depression, there are multiple things going on. So we look at the role that sickness can play in desperation that leads to suicidality, but also the role of shame, or in some cases it's sin. In some cases it's shame around identity. We look at the role of stress that people have, the role of societal, structural, and systemic issues that play out in our world. We know that if you're born on a reservation in rural Montana, your suicide rate is double that of someone who's born in Brooklyn. And we ask the question, why? What decisions are being made on behalf of those communities that are putting people at risk? The role of shunning, which we in the church can be notorious for, even though we don't think we do it. And then how the real truth is that for some people, suicidality is a signal that life as I know it is no longer working and I'm trapped, but have no idea how to get out. And so we ask the question for each of these, what would it look like if the church were to leverage its resources, not just to point people to the solution, but to become part of the solution? And we paint this beautiful picture of how the church can become hope with skin on for people who are struggling and suffering. So that's the work I do. That's the work I do in suicide prevention. And that's the vision of how we can invite churches to be about what they say they're about. So I'll stop there and just kind of open the conversation.
Well, let me follow up with a question, and then I'm going to get a couple out of the chat. One was, I need to tell folks, I had the pleasure of being able to sit in on one of Michelle's workshops just a week or two ago, and learned so much and came out of it feeling so much more prepared to be able to deal with the issue of suicidal thoughts and all the categories of people that Michelle mentioned. And you talk a lot in that workshop about normalizing the conversation about suicide in the church. And you just pointed toward that a little bit in the preaching, praying, teaching. Yeah. But why is that not a normal conversation in faith communities? Why do you think that's a main task we need to help do in our own communities and churches?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's lots and lots and lots of reasons that this conversation is stigmatized. I think the church hasn't been its friend. You know, it was in some people's recent memory that in the Catholic Church, you couldn't be buried in a Catholic cemetery if you died by suicide. So we have stigmatized it, and in the age of Christendom, you know, one of the benefits of the new normal is that around our bad theology, the church doesn't have as much influence in terms of forming our societal ethos. And so in this case, I think the church really made a mess of things. So that's one thing. There was a day, I think probably, I don't know, Jim, I don't know if this was in your lifetime, but when cancer was stigmatized, where people wouldn't talk about cancer. Do you remember that?
Well, the big C.
I don't remember it, but yeah, that's what people tell me in trainings. So I think anytime we don't know what to do with a thing and that thing is scary, it's anathema. We want to put it away. That was true of AIDS and HIV back in the day when we didn't know what to do with it. So I think the more information, the more we can educate, the more we can inform, the better. But I also think sometimes we go down the wrong path here because suicide isn't about suicide. Suicide is about all the things we find shameful. It's about, I had up the 6 S's of suicide. Do we know how to live with people who disappoint us? Do we know how to have hard conversations about gender and sexuality? Do we know how to be with people who are different than us? Do we because suicide isn't just one thing, it's complex. And when things are complex, when we don't know how to reduce them, we avoid them. And so we also want to fix, and with suicide, we don't always know how to fix. And I say to my groups, people say, well, I'm afraid I won't know what to say to fix it. And I say, let me break it to you. You won't. How are you going to fix Job? You can't fix Job. You can't fix that for him. What you can do is sit with him. And I don't know that we're comfortable just sitting with people. So the question of stigma is a really big one, and where does it come from? But I think the question of how we destigmatize is also multidimensional, and we've got lots of good ideas for that. Like one of the things we do in a training, I even do it when I preach about this in a 20-minute sermon. I'll have every person in the church write down the names of 3 people that they could tell if they ever start thinking about suicide. Some estimates are that 50% of people across a lifespan will think about suicide at some point in their life as a solution to their problems. And so just sitting beside people on both sides of me who have the names of 3 people written in their bulletin, and I as the speaker and their pastor, we're all writing down the names of 3 people, because this isn't a thing that happens to the broken. This isn't a thing that happens to the other. This is a thing that lives inside our walls, and it could be any one of us at any time. And so we try to destigmatize by saying it could be you and it could be me, and I have 3 people too. And we do that plus a whole bunch more to just chip away at this thing that we find really scary. So
I really appreciate it. And I found it interesting to notice the feelings I was experiencing when you just had us turn to one another in the workshop and use a sentence or say a sentence that included the word suicide.
Yeah.
We just don't talk about it in a lot of contexts. Some interesting questions and issues have come up in the chat, so I want to kind of pose those to you. Deborah asked about, in some Christian traditions, suicide gets referred to as the unforgivable sin. And she was wondering, do you still run into that as you do your workshops, and how do you address that issue when it comes up?
Yeah, I do run into it. I don't. People say it. I say, no, it isn't. And they say, oh, good. So like, I don't feel like I get a ton of theological resistance from people. What I hear is that people walk around with that message, but nobody, I mean, it's a bit of a straw fire. Like, it's not there. Nobody says it's there. I say, you'd have to do some theological gymnastics to get there if you wanted to get there. But what I do is actually pull out the Catholic Catechism, because I think that Catholicism is one of the places that it really that's where that has stemmed from. And the Catholic Catechism doesn't say it. I mean, the Catholic Catechism is actually starts with pro-life posture, names that life is God's and God's alone to take, but ends with, but salvation is God's to give, and we should not despair of the eternal salvation of a person who dies by suicide. And so I dispel it with information, but yeah, that floats around a bit. I suspect it floats around more among Catholics and like evangelicals than in the main line, which is where I find most of my home. But people bring it up. I say that's not there, and they say, oh, good. So that's kind of an easy one.
Right. Well, Terry and Deborah both also raised the issue of the particular categories of aging and Alzheimer's as populations that also think about suicide from time to time. And so how are there any statistics about does suicide thinking grow as people get older?
Yeah.
How do you talk with people with Alzheimer's or raise that conversation with them? Yeah.
So high suicide rates in America are 45 to 65-year-old white men. So there is something of a fall off as people age. That hasn't always been true. Older adults have some of the highest suicide rates. So I think right behind middle-aged white men in the list of people who die by suicide are like 65 to 85-year-old white men. But that used to be the very highest. We know that lethality gets higher with suicide attempts among the older adults. We have somewhere in the ballpark of 100 suicide attempts for every suicide among adolescents, and 6 attempts for every 1 suicide among older adults. So the older you are, the more well-planned you are, the more calculated you are, the more you've thought it through, the more you've practiced. With youth, I had an adolescent researcher tell me that suicide happens when distress overpowers resilience. And for young people, I think they've just got a lot of distress overpowering their resilience. For older folks, they really see suicide as a solution to the problem that they're facing. And that is, I'm about to lose my memory. Or I've got cancer and I don't want to be a burden or drain financial resources from my children. So the lethality gets higher as you get older among older adults. From my vantage point, it sounds like it could be an opt-out, although it really isn't, because I actually really believe this. I'm not talking about saving every life from suicide, or no, from death. Death is not the thing that we're trying to avoid. What I want to talk about is how we minister to despair. And so, even the suicide prevention community would like to decouple end of life choices and euthanasia and those kinds of conversations with the word suicide. Physician assisted suicide, we try not to use that because it muddies the waters. My question that I always respond when people ask it, they ask it a lot, and I always say, people of good faith live everywhere across the continuum when it comes to these end of life issues. But my question is the person making a choice from a position of community and hope, or are they making a choice from a place of isolation and despair? And if somebody is taking their life as a result of, Alzheimer's or dementia or other issues of aging or health, I want to know, have they made good choices in community with the people who love them, that they love, that they can feel good about? Or do they feel a kind of despair, so they do a desperate thing? And that's a very different conversation for me.
Right.
Yeah.
And Mary asked about, ask if you can talk a little bit more about how folks can be equipped to be able to be present with folks. And she talks about mental health crisis, but I'd like to focus it back down on suicide for you, since that's where you really do your ministry. Is how can we best equip, or what are ways we can equip church members, people of goodwill, to be able to be that presence with another that can bring hope?
Yeah, I mean, that feels like a tee up for a Soul Shop commercial. I did not mean to do that. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple to equip a group of people. It's really just about intentionality. I mean, once we have the intention to do it, we got the curriculum. You have, with whether it's a Sunday school class or a small group or a congregation or adjudicatory, first thing we do is have people turn to the person next to them and just use the word suicide. And then the next thing we do, we have a model. Many organizations do. QPR is a secular one. Safe Talk is a secular one. Talk Saves Lives through the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They're everywhere. And they teach you what to look for. What are the indicators? So we put those in people's hands. We give people a script for how to ask the question. We have them practice asking. We talk about the power of listening, and then we give people templates and resources for where to send people in their community. I think our biggest barrier is not knowing what to do. I think our biggest barrier is the courage to just name these things. So I find that in a Soul Shop training, by the end of the day, people are hugging and loving on each other and having really hard conversations. The hardest first thing they have to do in the day is to get that word suicide out of their mouth. And once they get it out of their mouth, then they've kind of overcome that emotional hurdle. So I think you could extrapolate that onto everything. Once I can say the word, pick the thing you put here: depression, eating disorders, domestic or sexual violence, gender dysphoria. As soon as we can get those words out and talk about them, then we can deal with the how-to and the what and the where and the when and the how. And we should, and we do, and that's important. But we really want to put front and center that the reason we're not having these conversations is primarily emotional. And so part of my work is helping people face their emotional wall, climb it, and then we get tools on the other side of it.
Yeah. It was a wonderful workshop. I would encourage people if you're interested in bringing a workshop to your area, that you get in touch with Soul Shop. This is shameless promotion here. soulshopmovement.org. And Michelle and others can tell you about what the opportunities are they can offer to your congregation, your judicatory, your town. So Michelle, thank you so much. This has really been a helpful conversation today, and I hope people go away knowing that there are resources that they can pick up and help their churches become more equipped for this ministry. Let me just say a little something about next week's webinar. Next week's speaker is Olu Brown, who is the author of Normalizing Next, a post-COVID-19 resource for church leaders. Olu was for a number of years was the lead pastor of a church in the East Point neighborhood in Metro Atlanta, a small church that grew to be one of the 25 fastest growing congregations in the United Methodist Church under his leadership. And now he has retired from that position and has developed a coaching and consulting ministry. And he's going to give us his own point as an African-American point of view as an African-American pastor about what are how do we continue to pivot and think about what's next and what's most helpful and what can we try. So invite you back next week to hear Olu Brown. And so a final thanks to you, Michelle, for this time and for your good work. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you